Right. So you thought about what is the alternative to using the law to discourage certain behavior. And what a lot of you wrote, which is what many people agree with, is that further education seems to be the solution. So, like with cigarettes, there is a lot of public education about the dangers and harms of cigarette smoking. There was better labeling on cigarette packs. And so now it's very clearly labeled what kind of dangers you could be putting your health in by smoking cigarettes. Of course, it hasn't completely stopped the behavior, but there's a lot more awareness. And this is what people think we should focus on when it comes to behaviors that we don't, that we think could harm an individual um, themselves, is just really increasing education and awareness about that issue. Okay, so then let's move on to the next theory, which is the most controversial of the theories, and it's called legal moralism. Legal moralism is what it sounds like, if you can kind of guess what it sounds like. It has to do with the uh, it's a position that says that the government has the obligation to enforce public morality using the full power of the government, regardless of whether anybody is harmed by the actions in question. So, legal moralism includes the harm principle. It includes saying um, that anything that harms other people should be illegal. It includes paternalism, so behaviors that harm oneself should also be restricted by the government. But it goes even further by saying things that don't necessarily cause any proven harm, but we find immoral, um, should also be restricted or regulated by the government. An example of this was or is how interracial marriage was for a long time illegal. It was something that did not show proven harm. I guess you could say this may fall under the offense principle, that people found it a little offensive. Not a little, people found it very offensive, and so they wanted it to be illegal. But more than that, people were just saying that it was wrong, it was immoral, it wasn't the natural way of things. Um, and for that reason, wanted to impose that view of morality through law and through the government. We have in this class before talked about the relationship between legality and morality, right? So there are some things that fall under the law that don't really have to do so much with morality. So if somebody doesn't make a full stop at a stop sign, for example, and no one's around, we won't necessarily say, like, oh, that's such an evil person, they're so immoral. Yeah, they did something that wasn't completely legal, but we may not think they're such a bad person for doing it. And then there's things that fall under the realm of morality that don't have to do with legal issues. So, um, uh, not telling, maybe lying to your mom or something, would be something that's, we would say, oh, that's not nice, that's immoral, but we're not going to make a law about it. And then there are things that overlap. So things that we agree are immoral, like murder or stealing, that we also think should be illegal. But usually because we can point to some definite harm that this has caused. The issue with legal moralism is that it takes the stuff that usually we would consider just within the realm of morality, that we can't really see how there's real harm being done to somebody else. Um, but then people want to regulate that through the law, right? So they basically say, if we think something is morally wrong, we want to impose that by making a law about it and saying that nobody should be able to do that. What are the laws that are typically based on legal moralism? It usually has, historically, it has covered sort of things that people do in the privacy of their bedrooms. So things related to sex and sexuality. So the illegality of homosexual sex has been something that has been on the books in a lot of states. Um, it is no longer a law. But up until very recently, sodomy was illegal in many states. Now, people could argue that if they're doing this in the privacy of their home and nobody really would know about it, there's a case where um, somebody called the cops on their neighbor saying that someone was being assaulted. The cops went in and they found two men who weren't even engaged in sex, but they were suspected of having had sex. And that's the case that went to the Supreme Court to challenge the anti-sodomy law. So anyway, the issue is if, two people are doing this in the privacy of their home, it's not affecting anybody else. Is this really something that the law should be involved with? Some would say yes, because this is immoral and we shouldn't allow this kind of behavior in our society. And others would say, if it's not affecting anybody else, this is really nobody's business and we shouldn't be making a law about it. And so, again, historically, there are lots of legal moralist laws regulating people's sexual behavior. Related to that are laws against polygamy. Some would argue that if, let's say, three people, a man and two women, or two women and a man, or three women or three men, if they're in a consensual polyamorous relationship where all the three of them want to be together, then why should society restrict that? Especially now that we allow gay marriage, and a lot of that was based on not having a prejudice about gender and letting people be with who they want to be with and love as long as they're not harming anybody else. Some people extend that argue to polygamy and say if everyone agrees and it's not a coerced marriage, it's not a forced marriage, um, there's no real obvious signs of inequity, then why also shouldn't this be allowed? And for most people, the answer is, well, we just think it's wrong. It's not the way it should be. If that's the reason, then that is legal moralism. And again, depending on whether or not you think that's a legitimate theory, that either holds water or not when it comes to issues like polygamy. And then other behaviors, not in this country, but in some societies, um, for example, if someone is viewing pornography in the privacy of their home, um, in some places that's illegal. Of course, when it comes to other forms of pornography that put, for example, children at risk, um, or could promote violence, then most people consider that to then fall under the harm principle. But if it's just something we think is bad and people shouldn't do, is that something that's just being justified through legal moralism? So, as you can see, this is probably the most controversial theory of laws, because all of these, we're telling people what they should or shouldn't do based on what we think is moral, but there may not necessarily be harm being caused to others. Sometimes when people argue for these types of laws against gay marriage or against polygamy, what people try to do is show that this isn't legal moralism, this is actually harm principle. So they actually try to find evidence to show that this kind of behavior causes harm, either to other people or to oneself. So, sort of like paternalism. And so what they try to, because it's pretty obvious that legal moralism is really controversial, they're trying to find a way to show that there's actual harm taking place and then justify their stance against certain behaviors, or in support of laws restricting these behaviors through the lens of harm instead of legal moralism. Of course, one of the major issues with moralism, besides the idea of imposing one's view of morality onto the rest of society, is whose view of morality do we take, right? Especially in a society like ours, and all societies, where there are varying views of what's right and wrong, what's moral and immoral. we fall into this danger of the majority saying what they think is moral and imposing their view of morality, and then minority voices getting drowned out, right? And so that's one of the issues. And again, even if it's not an issue of one voice getting drowned out, if there's multiple voices, maybe of equal volume, which one are we going to choose when it comes to um, imposing one view of morality uh, on people's behaviors? So this is part of what makes this particular theory so difficult and controversial, is that there isn't really a universally accepted moral code. The closest thing we have to that are behaviors that then would fall under the harm principle. So things like murder and stealing, you'd say, oh, well, everyone agrees on that. Well, they do for the most part, but then that falls under the harm principle, not legal moralism. All right, so those are the four major theories. Now that we've covered all of them, I do have a short quiz for you to take um, about these four theories. And then I have another project about this that that you will complete after the quiz. All right.